It was a calm autumn afternoon in 1974 when 11-year-old Owen Mercier left Pine Ridge Elementary just after noon. He wasn't the kind of kid to linger, quiet, punctual, always home before his mother's shift ended. That day, he walked the same short route he'd taken 100 times before. But this time, Owen never made it home, and no one could explain why. Owen Mercier was not the kind of boy people easily overlooked. At just 10 years old, he had a manner about him that suggested an old soul, a child who took his responsibilities seriously and never missed a step on his walk home from Pine Ridge Elementary. It was a small school nestled at the edge of Medford, Vermont, surrounded by sleepy homes, whispering trees, and the ever-present chirping of birds. The town itself was no more than 3,000 people, and everyone knew everyone, especially Owen. On the morning of October 14, 1974, nothing seemed unusual. The air was brisk with early autumn chill, and yellow leaves fluttered gently from the maples lining the school's front lawn. Owen had arrived early, as he always did, his uniform neat, his brown leather backpack strapped tightly to his shoulder. Inside were his usual items: a thermos of soup his mother had packed, a small tin of cookies, his math workbook, his favorite, and a folded paper airplane he never got around to finishing. He smiled politely to teachers, nodded at the janitor, and made his way to class. But when the final bell rang and children spilled out into the crisp afternoon sun, Owen was not among them. His best friend, Timmy Hart, said Owen had told him he might stop by the library before heading home, but the librarian, Mrs. Ellsworth, insisted she hadn't seen him all day, and by 4:30 p.m., when his mother, Rachel Mercier, began to worry, it was already too late. Rachel had worked the afternoon shift at Carter's Deli, just 2 blocks from the school. She was used to seeing Owen come through the door by 3:30, heading straight for the back room to do his homework, but that day he never showed. She called her neighbor to check, hoping maybe he'd gone home ahead of schedule. No answer. She closed the shop early and ran. The lights were off, the house empty, Owen's room untouched. By 6 p.m., she called the police. It wasn't long before the tight-knit community of Medford began to stir. Officer Glenn Matlock arrived at the Mercier home before sunset, calm but direct. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking door to door, asking the same urgent questions. Did you see Owen this afternoon? Was he walking alone? Did he say anything unusual? But everyone shook their heads. No one had seen him past lunchtime. As darkness set in, volunteers organized search parties. Flashlights blinked across fields, alleys, and wooded patches behind the school. Names were shouted into the cold wind, but no voice answered back. The next morning, the local paper printed a simple headline: 10-year-old missing, Medford searches for Owen Mercier. His picture, taken just 2 weeks earlier at school, showed a boy with tousled blonde hair and eyes too serious for his age. Detective Miriam Dalton took over the case on day 3. She was meticulous, a woman known for solving a string of child disappearances in another county years back. Her first question at the school wasn't about what Owen had done, but what he hadn't. She asked for attendance records, lunch logs, and footage, if any, from the dated hallway cameras. Nothing. Then she asked for his desk to be opened. Inside, she found his lunch thermos and the tin of cookies, untouched. The math workbook was missing. That would make sense, she thought, if he had taken it home. Except when they checked his locker and the school library, there was no sign of his backpack. That evening, Detective Dalton visited the Merciers' home. Rachel clutched a photo of Owen in her hands. He wouldn't go either if just had to wait until no time had passed before she presented it to Merciers' home. He said it was his shield. Dalton frowned. She had assumed Owen had it with him when he vanished, but the more she pieced together, the more it became clear. No one saw Owen with the backpack that day. Not in the morning, not at lunch, not when school ended. It was an odd detail, small but loud in the stillness of mystery. On day 5, a classmate came forward. Sarah Brody, shy and soft-spoken, said she'd seen Owen walking near the back entrance after lunch, alone but without his backpack. He looked like he was in a hurry, she said, and he kept looking over his shoulder. The detail gave Dalton pause. Why would a meticulous boy like Owen leave school without his things? And more importantly, why would he leave during lunch? The school janitor, Mr. Lyle, had no answers. He claimed he hadn't seen Owen anywhere unusual. "I cleaned the hallways between 1 and 2, he said. Didn't see a soul, not even a mouse. But when pressed, he hesitated, although I did hear a door slam near the old book storage under the west stairwell. No one uses that room anymore. Been locked for years." Dalton filed it away. Over the next week, search efforts expanded to nearby rivers, storm drains, and fields. Helicopters flew overhead. Bloodhounds tracked Owen's scent, but lost it at the school's rear fence. A small shoe print was found near the edge of the woods, but it didn't lead anywhere. Frustration began to set in. The town grew tense. Rumors swirled. Had someone taken him? Had he run away? Rachel refused to believe he had. Owen was scared of the dark, she said. He wouldn't even sleep without the hallway light. On the 12th day, as police began to scale back efforts, Dalton stood in the center of Owen's empty classroom. She stared at the vacant seat in the second row, next to the window. Light streamed through the glass, golden and indifferent. A place where a boy once sat, learning fractions, dreaming about becoming a train conductor. Now just gone. No evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no back package. It was as if Owen Mercier had been swallowed by the school itself. The first real lead came on the 17th day of the search, during a morning assembly hastily called by the school counselor. In a hushed gymnasium filled with restless children and wary parents, Principal Caro asked if anyone had seen Owen after lunch on the day he disappeared. Most shook their heads or looked down, unsure, unwilling to fray. But then a small hand rose from the third row of folding chairs. Charlie Whitley, a boy in Owen's class, thin as a rake and always biting his nails. When asked to speak, he cleared his throat and stammered, "I think I saw him." The room fell still. "After lunch, I was in the back hallway, near the supply closets. Owen was walking with someone, a man. He had a brown coat and a hat, like one of those old cones, with the brim." "A fedora?" the counselor asked gently. Charlie nodded. "Yeah, he was holding Owen's shoulder, like—" Dalton was called within minutes. She questioned Charlie again, this time alone, taking notes in her weathered leather notebook. "Did Owen seem scared?" she asked. I don't know. He wasn't fighting, but he didn't look happy." "Could you see the man's face?" Charlie shook his head. "Only from the side. He was taller than my dad, kind of hunched." "Did he say anything?" "No, they just turned the corner, and then I didn't see them anymore." Dalton checked with the rest of the students, staff, even janitorial workers, but no one else had seen a man in a fedora that day. None of the teachers recalled visitors, and the school didn't have sign-in procedures back then. No cameras, no record of comings or goings. It was a lead that appeared solid, but floated like smoke. By the end of the month, Detective Dalton had followed up on over 30 tips, most of them dead ends. 2 hikers claimed to have seen a boy matching Owen's description near Fox Hollow Creek, but their timing was off. A woman in a nearby county called to say a blond boy had knocked on her door asking for food, but she couldn't be sure. It might have been a prank. Slowly, the search efforts shrank. Flyers curled under the rain. The phone at the Mercier home stopped ringing. Rachel began to sit in Owen's room, silently folding and refolding his bed sheets. She stopped sleeping, stopped working, stopped talking much at all. Her ex-husband Daniel came by often, but they couldn't look each other in the eye. Too many things after Owen vanished. A letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, addressed not to the Mercier family, but to the Medford Police Department. No return address, no fingerprints. The paper inside was yellowed, slightly damp, as if stored somewhere unkind. The handwriting, angular, sharp, almost deliberate, contained only one sentence. "The boy has been saved from something worse." No signature, no explanation. The envelope had been dropped in an out-of-town mailbox with no cameras nearby. Forensics revealed nothing. No DNA, no traceable fibers, not even saliva on the seal. Dalton read it again and again, her brow furrowing deeper each time. What did it mean? Saved? From what? Who had written it? Someone involved? Someone watching? Was it a confession or a warning? The letters spurred brief media interest, but without follow-up information, the story faded once Square Grounds. A lone distribution had to sign in. Doors remained locked during the day, but the changes felt like patches on a dam already cracked wide. Dalton tried retracing her steps, visiting Charlie Whitley's home again. "Are you sure about the hat?" she asked. "Could it have been someone you knew?" Charlie looked down. "No one I knew. But I've thought about it a lot." He didn't walk like a stranger. That phrasing stayed with Dalton. What did it mean to not walk like a stranger? As winter settled into Medford, snow blanketed the town and covered every corner that might have held a clue. Footsteps in frozen ground disappeared overnight. Time became an enemy. Witnesses forgot. Files went dusty. Rachel Mercier fell ill with pneumonia, and for weeks her recovery took all her energy. She never asked Dalton for updates. She no longer hoped. Daniel, meanwhile, grew reclusive. He turned to drink. At one point, police were called to his property when neighbors heard shouting, but nothing came of it. He told officers he had been arguing with ghosts. In her office, Dalton placed the anonymous letter inside a plastic sleeve and pinned it to her board. Above it, a photo of Owen smiling in a red-striped sweater. Below, the note, saved from some exaggeration. The ambiguity gnawed at her. What could be worse than disappearing forever? At the precinct, an older officer suggested it might be a cruel joke. Another wondered if it was from a guilty party trying to absolve themselves. Dalton wasn't sure, but she wasn't ready to let it go. On a hunch, she went through staff members or visitors who once wore such a hat. Nothing stood out. She searched nearby psychiatric records for any recent escapes or discharges near the time of Owen's disappearance. Still, nothing matched. A single moment returned to her. The janitor, Mr. Lyle, had once mentioned hearing a door slam. She had followed up, even searched the room he had referenced, but at the time it was empty, locked, covered in dust. Now, months later, she wondered, had she looked closely enough? She requested keys again, but the room had since been cleared for storage and nothing seemed amiss. That is, until... The year was 1976, and Medford had already moved on. Pine Ridge Elementary underwent minor renovations, the local store changed ownership, and the empty lot behind the Mercier house had been turned into a community garden. But inside 44 Laurel Street, time had stopped. Daniel Mercier still lived there, alone now, in a home that once echoed with Owen's laughter. Rachel had left just months after the divorce was finalized. Their marriage, once quiet and functional, had crumbled under the pressure of the unspeakable void. For a while they had tried to pretend they could rebuild, that the grief could be carried together. But each glance turned sharp, each silence heavier. They began to blame each other in ways neither said aloud. Rachel eventually moved to Hartford, Connecticut, taking only her clothes and a box of photos. She never spoke to reporters again. Daniel stayed. He said he wanted to be nearby if Owen ever came back. In reality, he couldn't let go. Owen's room remained untouched, the same toy train set on the shelf, the same red-striped sweater draped over the chair, the same baseball glove on the windowsill, still marked with dirt from the last game they'd played. Each morning, Daniel would open the blinds to let in the sunlight, dust the surfaces with a quiet reverence, then sit on the edge of the bed, sometimes for hours. The neighbors stopped checking in. Whispers grew. "He's not right," someone muttered at the diner. "Still talks to the kid like he's there," said another. But no one dared confront him. No one dared say it out loud. Daniel was always a bit intense, even before Owen disappeared. Strict, they used to say. A disciplinarian, Rachel had once confided in her sister that Daniel kept schedules for Owen so tight the boy wasn't allowed to deviate 5 minutes without consequence. "Just wants structure," Rachel had explained. "He says it keeps Owen safe." But others had noticed things. A retired teacher, Mrs. Donovan, remembered Owen flinching once when she raised her voice at another student. "It wasn't fear of me," she had told Dalton months after the initial investigation. "It was something else, like he was used to punishment." A neighbor, Mrs. Halpern, recalled hearing raised voices in the Mercier backyard, mostly the father shouting. Owen never yelled back. None of these were formal complaints. No marks, no bruises, no official reports, just tension, always beneath the surface. Detective Dalton kept a thin file labeled Mercier Daniel in her drawer. It contained nothing incriminating, no evidence, only anecdotes, fragments, enough to raise questions, but not enough to pursue. One note stood out. Subject has obsessive routines, has not removed any of child's belongings, observed watering lawn at 6 a.m. daily, same path, same time. Possible behavioral compulsion. She had once asked Daniel during a welfare check if he needed help. Counseling, perhaps. He had stared at her expression unreadable. Help? No, I need answers. By late 1977, Dalton herself had been reassigned. The case, cold and stagnant, remained open in name only. She passed the files to a new detective who didn't believe in revisiting ghosts. The town's interest in Owen's disappearance faded like old ink. Daniel, however, never let it go. He filed a handhead report every October to the local precinct, detailing Owen's physical features, habits, and what he believed the boy might look like now. He sent copies to the State Missing Persons Registry, to the FBI, even to talk shows. No one responded, but he kept writing. One fall evening in 1978, Daniel visited Pine Ridge during an open house event. He asked to see the library. The new staff obliged, not realizing who he was. He wandered among the shelves, hand grazing the wood, until he stopped near the back corner where the old storage room used to be. He stood there for a long time. When asked if he needed anything, he simply said, "I'm listening," then walked out. That same week, a parent volunteer reported seeing Daniel speaking to himself while staring into Owen's old classroom window. He was saying something like, "You never finish what you start," the woman recalled. But no complaint was filed. Dalton heard about it through a friend at City Hall, and though she no longer held jurisdiction, she drove to 44 Laurel one evening. She parked outside, watched the porch light flicker. Through the window she saw him seated in Owen's room, reading aloud to the empty bed. It wasn't madness, she thought. It was something more dangerous, grief solidified into ritual. She debated knocking, but didn't. Instead, she drove home and added a dated note to the folder she still secretly kept. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that 5 years earlier, 2 reports had been filed with the Medford School District about Daniel Mercier's behavior toward Owen. One from a substitute teacher who saw Daniel grip Owen's wrist too hard during drop-off. The other from a crossing guard who overheard an argument, ending with Daniel saying, "I own your time, Owen. Don't forget that." Both reports had been quietly archived. No follow-up, no investigation. Parents talked among themselves but took no action. Daniel had no accolade, no charges, and a reputation as a war veteran trying to raise a son alone. He paid his taxes, showed up to PTA meetings, even hosted a block party once. Everyone assumed he was just strict, but assumptions are blindfolds. Now, in the shadows of a house frozen in 1974, surrounded by fading wallpaper and the scent of lemon polish, Daniel Mercier sat alone, waiting for a doorbell that would never ring. Until one morning, 50 years is a long time, long enough for memories to fade, for facts to soften, and for tragedy to become folklore. By 2024, Pine Ridge Elementary had transformed almost completely. The original brick walls were now covered in composite panels, smartboards had replaced chalkboards, and the old library had been relocated to the east wing to accommodate a media center. But tucked behind what used to be the janitor's hallway, still insulated by the scent of varnish and forgotten paper, stood the original storage room, now an archive of old textbooks, broken chairs, and boxes no one dared to throw away. It was April when Ms. Dana Holloway, a newly transferred literature teacher, proposed a spring cleaning and donation drive to repurpose unused materials for underfunded schools. She was meticulous, with a quiet tenacity that charmed even the most resistant of staff. With a group of eager 8th graders, she began sorting through the dusty stacks. The job was tedious. Dusty spines, torn covers, outdated atlases from the 1980s, but satisfying in its way. Then, in the far back corner, behind a rusted filing cabinet, one of the students, Ava Lynn, called out, "Miss Holloway, this one's locked?" Dana walked over. It was a wooden drawer, half the size of a locker, set low into the wall, reinforced with a small brass padlock, tarnished by time. No one she asked knew what was inside or remembered ever seeing it used. Probably just junk, the janitor shrugged, but Dana's curiosity wasn't so easily dismissed. She requested access from Principal Heron, who handed over a ring of inherited keys with a bemused smile. "Good luck," he said. It took an hour, but one key eventually clicked. The padlock creaked open like a groan, the air behind the drawer thick with must and something else, something old and faintly acidic, like mildew and forgotten sorrow. She opened the compartment slowly. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be decades-old tissue paper, was a brown leather satchel. The kind a boy might carry his books in. Dana reached for it cautiously. The leather had cracked in places, but the seams were intact. There was embroidery along the back flap, faded but still legible. Her breath caught. She had heard the name before, all the teachers had. It was whispered during orientation, muttered in passing by long-serving staff. The boy who disappeared, the child ghost of Pine Ridge. It's probably a replica, one of the older teachers would later suggest. Just a coincidence. But Dana wasn't convinced. She took the bag into the main office. They opened it together, gingerly, like it might fall apart. Inside were 3 workbooks, math, social studies, and science, all dated 1974. There was a pencil box with 2 erasers, a ruler, and a rusted compass. And at the bottom, curled and yellowed, was a single scrap of lined notebook paper. The writing, jagged and pressed deep into the page as if with fear, read, "He waits until I fall asleep." The room fell silent. Principal Heron stepped back. "That can't be real," he muttered. "It's been 50 years." Dana didn't respond. She simply stared at the words. The ink had bled slightly from age, but it was unmistakable. A child's handwriting? Or maybe a confession? She contacted the local precinct. The item was taken into evidence the same day. Forensics was called, photographs were taken, and the story returned. Within 48 hours, the town of Medford was buzzing again. The news spread quickly. Reporters appeared at the school gates. Microphones were thrust into teachers' faces. "Do you believe this bag is authentic? Could Owen still be alive? What does the note mean?" But no one had answers. What they had was a name, a satchel, and a message that felt more haunting now than it might have 50 years ago. When Detective Elena Moore, a younger officer with a reputation for solving cold cases, took over, she immediately contacted the old files. She called Miriam Dalton, long since retired, but still sharp. Dalton came to the station the next day, weathered folder in hand, eyes sunken but burning with clarity. She looked at the bag. Her face changed. "That's it," she whispered. "That's it." The handwriting was compared with Owen's old worksheets match. The paper's age aligned with the timeline. No fingerprints were recoverable due to decay, but the stitching, the material sought, all authentic to the era. But the question remained, how did it end up locked away? And who locked it? The drawer itself hadn't been disturbed in years. That section of the school had been boarded up twice during renovations and only reopened when Pine Ridge expanded in 2018. The padlock was of a model discontinued in 1981. No staff records from 1974 indicated anyone had a key to that drawer, but there had been turnover, people who left, people who vanished. "He waits until I fall asleep." It echoed in everyone's minds. Did Owen write it? Was it about his captor? Did he know he was being watched, stalked, preyed upon within the school itself? Or worse, was he hiding there all along, just steps away, behind locked doors no one thought to open? Dana Holloway stepped away from the investigation quietly after that. She said she felt watched, though she didn't elaborate. Students began refusing to enter the archive room. Some said they heard noises, scraping, whispering. Ava Lynn told her mother she dreamed about a boy whispering the phrase from the note over and over. "He waits, he waits." Principal Heron insisted it was just post-sim hysteria. But deep down, even he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong, not just 50 years ago, but still, now. Meanwhile, Detective Moore opened a new file, pinned the photo of the bag next to the only surviving image of Owen Mercier, and started drawing lines, asking questions, turning over stones no one had touched in decades. And then she found Detective Elena Moore stood in the cold gray hallway outside the archive room, its freshly installed security tape fluttering gently with the hum of the air conditioning. The recent discovery of Owen Mercier's satchel had rattled the community. Vastin Grace meant to miss Faith, but Moore wasn't interested in the folklore. She wanted facts, concrete, verifiable, unflinching. Her instinct told her the key was in the room itself. She requested the original floor plans of Pine Ridge Elementary from the city's building department, hoping to understand how a locked drawer could have remained undisturbed for 5 decades. The blueprints arrived in brittle manila folders, corners frayed, and pages yellowed. As Moore unfolded the 1972 layout, she immediately noticed something odd. The room labeled as the current archive space had a different designation back then: guards' quarters. She blinked, leaning closer. According to the plans, the space was once a small residential unit, outfitted with a cot, locker, and private restroom. In the margins, handwritten in red ink, was a single word: decommissioned 1975. Moore frowned. Why would a school have a live-in guard? And why was the room sealed off shortly after Owen's disappearances? She dove into administrative records stored digitally in the school district's archive and cross-referenced them with printed personnel logs from the 1,970s housed in the municipal basement. The process was slow, pages brittle and ink fading, but eventually she found what she was looking for. A personnel entry dated June 1974 listing a night security, Madison Palm, age 46, listed as night security, Pat Ridge Elementary. His employment record was brief. Hired in June, final day of employment, November 19, 1974. No resignation letter. No formal exit interview, just a hastily scribbled note in the margin: voluntary separation. What caught Moore's attention most wasn't just the timing, it was that no one had ever mentioned this man before. Not in the original case files, not in Dalton's meticulous notes. Vaughn had simply vanished from the narrative. She dug deeper. There were no current contact details. His file listed a P.O. box as his home address and a reference from another school 3 towns over. That school had closed in the late 80s. Moore drove to the site, now an apartment complex, and asked around. A groundskeeper, old enough to remember the transition, vaguely recalled a man named Vaughn. Kept to himself, he said, smoked these awful little cigars, had a limp, never smiled. When asked if Vaughn ever talked about Pine Ridge, the man shook his head. Didn't like questions, moved out real quiet. Heard he'd been in some kind of trouble before. Moore returned to Medford with more questions than answers. She pulled the building maintenance records for Pine Ridge from late 1974. They showed minor work orders, pipe repairs, a faulty boiler, but one entry stood out: seal interior unit, November 25. No reason given, no documentation of what was done. She interviewed retired staff members who had worked at the school during that period. Most claimed not to remember Vaughn. One, a former janitor named Ellis, recalled a quiet guy, heavy coat even in summer. He remembered that Vaughn sometimes stayed late, claiming to be doing round. When asked directly about the guards' quarters, Ellis paused. They closed it up fast. One day it was his space, next week locked. No one told us why. Moore found this increasingly unsettling. A boy vanished. A man with access to a private room on campus left without notice days later. That room was sealed. The boy's satchel was found inside. How had this never been flagged? She contacted the state archives to search for any legal records on Vaughn, arrests, court appearances, anything. After a week, a report surfaced. In 1963, Lester Vaughn had been investigated in Albany for unusual behavior around minors at a community center. No charges were filed, and the report was buried when the witness recanted. But it was enough to send a chill down Moore's spine. She requested any employment applications Vaughn may have submitted to Pine Ridge. The original paper copy was located in a misfiled folder. It was sparse. Name, age, a forged address that led nowhere. His listed emergency contact had a disconnected number. His handwriting was tight, angled, and oddly similar to the note found in Owen's satchel. Moore brought the documents to a forensic analyst. The expert wasn't definitive but said the similarities were notable. The same slanted pressure, the same irregular spacing. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. As Moore assembled her findings into a preliminary report, she felt the case shifting. This wasn't just a cold trail warmed by coincidence. This was negligence, suppression. A child had disappeared, a room had been sealed, a man with a dark past had vanished from employment records. She contacted the property manager of the apartment building where the archive room now stood. With permission, she re-entered the space, this time accompanied by a crime scene unit. They scanned every inch, every corner, using thermal imaging to detect structural inconsistency. Near the base of the northern wall, they found it, a shallow void behind the drywall, just large enough to crawl through. It had been plastered over decades ago, but irregular temperature readings suggested airflow behind it. The unit began carefully removing sections, dust swirling as paint flaked like ash. As the opening widened, the room fell silent. There, in the dark recess, lay the void behind the wall was empty. Dust floated like spores in the beam of the flashlight as Detective Moore leaned in, scanning every surface. There were no remains, no hidden compartments, no secret messages scratched into plaster, just a stale odor of mildew and time. But something about the dimensions of the crawlspace suggested deliberate construction. A small cavity carved for temporary concealment, then forgotten. It deepened Moore's sense that someone had used this space for something, briefly, intentionally, and then sealed it forever. With that lead exhausted, Moore turned her attention back to Lester Vaughn. The name now carried a strange weight, the kind that settles into the corners of a case like sediment in water. She needed more. The state death registry confirmed it. Lester Vaughn, deceased, March 1991, industrial accident, upstate New York. He had been working in a scrapyard, crushed beneath a load of improperly secured sheet metal. No foul play suspected, but Moore wasn't done. Every man leaves a shadow. She traced surviving relatives and found one, Thomas Vaughn, younger brother, still living in Vermont, in a rural county northeast of Barr. The property was listed under his name, a modest house, red shutters, surrounded by fir trees and frozen silence. Moore made the drive herself. The man who opened the door was in his 70s, stooped but alert, a hand-rolled cigarette trembling between his fingers. He didn't flinch when she introduced herself. In fact, he seemed to have been expecting this visit for years. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, lined with framed photos of mountains and a fireplace filled with ashes gone cold. He offered her tea, which she declined, and sat across from her in a threadbare chair. "You're here about Lester," he said, before she asked a single question. Moore nodded. "Worked at Pine Ridge Elementary in 1974. Disappeared from records the same month a child named Owen Mercier went missing." Thomas didn't speak immediately. He stared into the hearth, jaw clenching slightly. "He wasn't a bad man," he said at last, "but he had shadows in him, things he carried back from the war, things he never talked about." Moore listened, waiting. "He came to stay with me in late '74, Thomas continued. Said he'd left the job, no explanation, just walked out. I asked why. He didn't answer, but a few weeks later he said something strange, something I never forgot." Thomas leaned forward. "He said, 'Tommy, there are things you can't undo, things that follow you. Something happened at Pine Ridge, something I couldn't forgive myself for.'" Moore felt her pulse spike. "Did he say what it was?" "No," Thomas said quietly. "He refused to explain, said talking about it would only make it worse. He started drinking more, kept to himself, but he never gave me a name." Moore pressed for more. Memories, letters, anything Lester might have left behind. Thomas shook his head. "He burned everything before he died. Said he didn't want his past haunting anyone else." But then, almost as an afterthought, Thomas opened a drawer beside the fireplace and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "This came a few weeks after he died," he said. "I found it behind the dresser." Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was familiar sheet of lined paper. He read, "I tried to watch over him. I did. But some nights I slept too deeply." It wasn't signed. Moore took the envelope, gloves on, and slid it into her evidence pouch. Back in Medford, her thoughts spiraled. What did Lester mean by watch over him? Did Owen ever reach the guard's room? Was Lester his captor or his protector? The note's ambiguity gnawed at her. If Lester had truly harmed the boy, why leave behind such a guilty whisper? But if he was trying to help, why disappear without explanation? She returned to the original personnel interviews, searching for any mention of night activities, any staff who might have seen Owen near that hallway. One teacher had noted in 1974 that she once saw a child walking alone toward the east wing near dusk, but she assumed it was a mistake. No follow-up was made. Moore expanded the search to include local law enforcement records from 1974-75, looking for reports of break-ins or strange activity near the school. One thin file emerged from a sheriff's office in a neighboring county, dated December 1974. A man was stopped walking barefoot along a highway, incoherent and mumbling about keeping the boy safe. He had no idea and refused to speak his name. The description loosely matched Lester Vaughn. The officer on duty at the time logged it as a mental health incident and transported the man to a clinic overnight. He vanished from the system the next day. No charges, no follow-up. The timeline aligned disturbingly well. Owen went missing in October. Lester quit in November. This sighting was in December. Moore contacted the old clinic. The records had been digitized. The intake notes were brief but chilling. They record note approximately half her age. Desat's photo. Erratic speech. Moore printed the note and pinned it next to the satchel photo. Piece by piece a picture was forming, not of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man consumed by guilt. A man who believed he was failing someone he had vowed to protect. But if Lester hadn't harmed Owen, then someone else had. Someone who knew the school, who had access, who disappeared from suspicion just as effectively as Lester had disappeared from memory. Moore leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the floor plan of Pine Ridge. There was still one area she hadn't explored, the sub-basement, once used for equipment storage, later marked as sealed during renovation. No recent staff had keycard access, no motion sensors installed. She made a note, then she opened a new document and typed 3 words. Reopen basement access, because if Owen had ever truly been hidden in that school and Lester Vaughn had failed to stop it, then the person responsible might still have left something buried there. Something that Detective Elena Moore stood in the dimly lit sub-basement beneath Pine Ridge Elementary's library, the air thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. The recent discoveries had led her here, to a place untouched for decades. The original 1965 floor plans indicated a uniform concrete foundation, yet her team had identified a section of the floor that appeared inconsistent with the rest. The concrete in this area was lighter in color, smoother, and lacked the wear evident elsewhere. It was as if this portion had been poured more recently, a stark contrast to the surrounding aged flooring. She called in the forensic team, who confirmed her suspicions. The anomalous section measured approximately 6 feet by 6 feet, its edges not aligning with any known renovations or maintenance records. The school's archives held no mention of any work done in this area, raising immediate red flags. With the principal's reluctant approval, Moore authorized the removal of the suspicious concrete. As the jackhammers broke through the surface, a hollow sound echoed, confirming the existence of a void beneath. After hours of careful excavation, the team uncovered a wooden frame embedded within the foundation. A trapdoor, its surface aged but intact. The wood was old, yet the nails and hinges appeared newer, suggesting it had been sealed intentionally. Moore knelt beside the opening, her flashlight piercing the darkness below. A narrow wooden staircase descended into the unknown, the air growing colder with each step. She descended cautiously, the creaking steps echoing in the confined space. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, windowless room, its walls lined with soundproof material. The room contained a single cot, a small desk, and a chair. On the desk lay a stack of children's books, a worn notebook, and a pencil. The notebook's pages were filled with drawings, crude sketches of a boy, a man in a hat, and various scenes that seemed to depict a daily routine. The forensic team documented every detail, collecting samples and photographing the scene extensively. The room's existence was a revelation, a hidden chamber beneath the school, unrecorded and concealed for decades. Moore couldn't shake the feeling that this room had been used to confine someone, possibly Owen Mercier. The implications were chilling. Back in her office, Moore reviewed the findings. The drawings in the notebook suggested a prolonged stay, with depictions of meals, reading sessions, and a consistent presence of the man in the hat. The soundproofing indicated an effort to muffle any noise, preventing detection. She cross-referenced the sketches with old staff photos, focusing on individuals who wore hats regularly. One image stood out, a maintenance worker from the 1970s, often seen wearing a distinctive fedora. His name was Harold Finch, a janitor who had resigned abruptly in late 1974. His personnel file was sparse, with no forwarding address or subsequent employment records. Moore delved deeper, uncovering a pattern of complaints about Finch's behavior. Nothing overtly criminal, but enough to raise concerns. Teachers had noted his tendency to linger near classrooms, his unsolicited interactions with students, and his presence in areas he had no reason to be. Yet no formal action had been taken. She tracked down former staff members, hoping to gather more information. Many were deceased or unreachable, but one retired teacher, Margaret Holloway, agreed to meet. Over tea, Margaret recounted her memories of Finch. "He was always there," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Not doing anything wrong per se, but his eyes. They watched everything. I remember once, after Owen disappeared, I found Finch in the library basement, just standing there. He said he was checking for leaks, but it felt off." Moore's investigation led her to Finch's last known residence, a small house on the outskirts of town. The property had changed hands multiple times, but she managed to locate the current owner, who allowed her to search the premises. In the attic, she discovered a box of personal items, photographs, letters, and a journal. The journal entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about guilt, redemption, and the boy. One entry read, "I tried to make it right, to care for him, but the walls closed in. The silence became too loud." The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Finch had the opportunity, the means, and a motive rooted in a twisted sense of guardianship. Moore compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, presenting it to the district attorney. While the case was decades old, the discovery of the hidden room and Finch's journal provided a new avenue for justice. As the legal wheels began to turn, Moore couldn't help but reflect on the resilience of secrets and the lengths to which some would go to bury the past. The walls of Pine Ridge Elementary had absorbed years of laughter, learning, and, unbeknownst to many, a dark chapter that was finally coming to light. But the question remained: what else lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? Detective Moore returned to the underground room with a forensic team in tow, the scent of mildew and rust settling heavy in the air like an unspoken accusation. The silence in the chamber was different now, less of a mystery and more of a confession. As the floodlights were repositioned, details began to emerge that hadn't been visible during the initial sweep. Along the northern wall, just beneath the soundproofing material, a rusted metal bracket protruded slightly from the concrete. One technician carefully peeled back the deteriorated insulation and revealed what had once been a chain mount, still bearing the remnants of an iron link, its broken edge jagged and orange with corrosion. Below it, the wall showed faint abrasions, scratches that suggested movement, resistance. It wasn't just a room, it was a cell. Moore stepped closer, kneeling beside the wall, brushing away years of dust with her gloved hand. Near the baseboard, tucked in a crevice of chipped concrete, she found something even more telling. A small piece of wood, no bigger than a child's finger, worn smooth along one edge and sharpened at the other. A pencil, barely legible but undeniably present, were faint etchings carved into its side. Friday, no light. The words were disjointed, childlike, as if written in haste or fear. Moore felt the hair on her arms rise. This was Owen. It had to be. She signaled to the forensics lead, who began cataloging the objects immediately. Moments later, another technician called her over. Near the desk, wedged behind a leg of the chair, they had discovered a piece of fabric. It was a sleeve, blue cotton, frayed and torn at the seam. One side bore what looked like a school patch, nearly worn away, but still readable under magnification. The sleeve had clearly been ripped from a shirt, and near the edge, tiny specks of what appeared to be dried blood dotted the inner lab. Moore's heart clenched. The item was carefully bagged and sent to the lab for analysis. Back at the precinct, she waited anxiously for the DNA results, poring over every scrap of evidence and comparing them with old police reports, photographs, and school records. 2 days later, the confirmation arrived. Mitochondrial DNA extracted from the torn fabric matched a sample taken from Genevieve Mercier, Owen's mother, preserved in the police archives. The result was not just a breakthrough, it was the first irrefutable proof that Owen had, in fact, been inside that room. And more than that, he had likely been held there for an extended period. Moore stared at the report, letting the implications settle over her like fresh concrete. The scratch marks on the wall, the pencil message, the chain mount, these weren't just pieces of a puzzle. They were screams, preserved in silence. The reality of Owen's last days was becoming clearer and more haunting. Moore revisited the notebook found on the desk. The drawings now took on a deeper, more disturbing meaning. In one sketch, the boy stood near what appeared to be a bed, while a larger figure loomed in the corner, eyes drawn as dark, empty ovals. Another showed a door barred with planks, and outside the door, lines that may have been the light of the hallway or the bars of a cage. She had the pages analyzed again. One sketch, previously dismissed as abstract, revealed a chilling detail under UV light, a hidden series of tally marks on the wall beside the boy, 22 of them. 22 days. It was possible that Owen had been trapped down there for over 3 weeks before he was moved, or worse. Moore updated the case file and arranged a meeting with the district attorney, but her focus remained on Finch. If Harold Finch had kept Owen in that room, then why the elaborate concealment? Why the drawings? The entries in his journal portrayed guilt, not malice. But that didn't exonerate him. Perhaps he had helped at first, perhaps he had tried to watch over the boy as he wrote. But in the end, he had failed. And someone else had come for Owen. Another name emerged from her review of the 1974 staff logs, Norman Coyle, a substitute teacher with a brief, unexplained stint at Pine Ridge just weeks before the disappearances. His file was thin, his background check minimal. Moore dug deeper, contacting the state archives and obtaining a more detailed personnel history. Coyle had moved between several schools, never staying more than a semester. No criminal charges, but rumors surfaced in older memos, concerns about his interactions with students, whispers of inappropriate behavior that never reached formal complaints. His last recorded job was in Massachusetts, in 1980, after which he seemed to vanish from public records. In a 1982 local newspaper, she found a small obituary for a man named Norman Coyle, who had died in a car accident in western Maine. The photo matched his Pine Ridge personnel file, another dead end. But the evidence found in the hidden room painted a different story, of a child who had been alive, captive, and ultimately lost again. Moore organized a press briefing, carefully wording the new developments. She withheld the more disturbing details but confirmed the room's discovery, the matching DNA, and the likely time Owen had been held there. The town of Medford reacted with shock and grief. For those who remembered the boy, the revelation reopened old wounds. For others, it was a reminder of how close horror had once lived beneath their feet. In the days that followed, members of the community left flowers at the school's gate. One parent placed a toy airplane and a handwritten note that simply read, "You were never forgotten." Moore returned to the chamber one last time, alone. She stood in the center, imagining the darkness, the quiet, the waiting. 22 days of silence. The walls seemed to press inward. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting long, uncertain shadows across the room as she turned toward the far wall, where faint scratches lingered just above the concrete base. There were more than she'd noticed before. Symbols, maybe letters, but some looked newer, and the dust around the corner of the baseboard appeared disturbed. She crouched again, brushing gently. Something gave beneath her hand. Another hollow space, smaller, cleverly concealed. Her breath caught. She reached for her tools and began to carefully pry at the edge. Detective Elena Moore's pen paused mid-air as her eyes narrowed on the brittle sheet of lined paper inside the old staff folder. The journal entry, dated November 12, 1974, was scrawled in the confident cursive of Principal Vernon Hall, who had passed away more than 2 decades ago. Student Owen Mercier came to my office visibly shaken, mentioned Coach McKinney threatened him over talking too much. I advised him to focus on classwork and promised to follow up. That was it. Just a single paragraph, but to Elena it felt like a seismic crack through the foundation of a long cold case. She flipped back through the faculty list from that year, her finger landing on the name Red McKinney, physical education teacher. Hired September 1974, no formal complaints. Resigned abruptly on November 18th, exactly 3 days after Owen was last seen. The timing was suffocatingly precise. She checked the resignation form, one line, typed, leaving due to family emergency. No contact information, no subsequent employment recorded within the state. Elena felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. She ran the name through the department's aging internal database. Nothing. Switched to state-level education board archives. One hit. McKinney had been employed at a school in Albany before Pine Ridge, St. Martha's Catholic Academy. She pulled a few strings and had the personnel file faxed within the hour. The file was thin, but one stapled internal memo caught her breath. Student concern reported, re-R McKinney's supervision style. No evidence found. It was dated April 1973. The student's name was redacted, but the pattern was loud despite the silence. Back in Medford, Elena stared at the growing timeline pinned to her corkboard. Owen spoke up. McKinney resigned. The hidden room was buried beneath fresh concrete weeks later. None of this was accidental. She drove back to the school and requested access to the remaining basement records, including janitorial shift logs from that fall. Among the dusty jedgers, she found a schedule marked in pencil with initials, assigned to after-hours supervision on 4 consecutive Fridays, leading up to Owen's disappearances. The same Fridays that his classmates remembered him staying late for detention, though no such detentions were documented. She sat in Owen's former classroom after dark, lights off, imagining the layout of the building in 1974. The gym had been connected to the west wing through the old corridor, the same corridor that ran just above the library. If McKinney had used the basement room, it would have been quiet, hidden, almost perfectly placed. She tried to reconstruct his movements. A hallway camera might have captured footage, if one had existed back then. But the school didn't install surveillance until 1982. All she had were whispers, ghosts, and a few surviving documents. The next day, Elena met with a retired teacher who had worked at Pine Ridge during those years, Mr. Walter Greaves. His memory was dim, but when she mentioned McKinney, his expression stiffened. "Strange man," he muttered. "Discipline boys, the old-scashin' went the old-fashioned way. Once told me he liked to discipline boys the old-fashioned way." Greaves admitted that no one ever pushed back. "We were told not to ask questions," he added, with a bitter laugh. Different time. Armed with this, Elena submitted a formal inquiry to the state board to investigate whether McKinney had ever been red-flagged. She also requested interviews with anyone from St. Martha's who had filed internal complaints. But time had washed away much of the trail. Staff had retired, some had passed on, and memories, if they existed, were foggy. Yet everything pointed to the same conclusion. Owen had felt unsafe. He had confided in someone, and no one had listened. Back at her desk, Alicia placed the original journal entry beside a photo of Owen, his hopeful face framed by his shaggy brown hair, eyes open wide, too trusting. She stared at the signature beneath Principal Hall's note. If only he'd done more than promise a follow-up. If only someone had knocked on McKinney's door. She thought of Genevieve Mercier, who had once told the media that her son never said goodbye, only see you later. The photo blurred as anger pressed into Elena's chest. She scribbled in her notebook. What was McKinney afraid Owen would talk about? She circled the question twice, hard enough to tear the page slightly. There was one more place to look. Inside the school supply room, still untouched since the renovations began, she asked the custodial staff to help her locate any unarchived PE files from the 70s. Most were moldy or blank, but one folder labeled Disciplinary Logs caught her attention. It was half burnt at the edges, as if someone had tried to destroy it. She opened it carefully. A few names, some dates, and then a slip of paper taped to the back cover. Locker 18, do not open. Rand. She stared at it. Locker 18 had been welded shut years ago during a safety update. She radioed for the groundskeeper. Within the hour, they pried it open. Inside was only dust and a single envelope, no address, no seal. Inside, a page lined and written in a rushed, shaky hand. He said, if I tell, he'll make it worse. He's not like other teachers. He watches the cracks in the wall. I don't sleep on Fridays. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but it was real. Elena held it with gloves as she photographed every angle. She wasn't sure who had written it, the phrasing, the fear. It could have been Owen, or another boy. Either way, the note was a scream, frozen in time. As she stood alone in the old locker room, the lights above flickered once, then steadied. She glanced back at the cracked tile, wondering what other secrets had been sealed in silence. Then her phone buzzed. It was the forensics lab. They had something. 3 months had passed since Detective Elena Moore's last discovery inside the locker room, and the school grounds had become oddly quiet again, as if collectively exhaling after decades of suffocating silence. Media crews had packed up, the special task force had wrapped their immediate search, and Picano's headlines had begun to wane. But Elena hadn't stopped. She couldn't. There were still too many unanswered questions, and no matter how many fragments she had stitched together, the one final truth, what actually happened to Owen Mercier, remained painfully unresolved. It was on a Tuesday morning in late May when the department's tip line lit up with an anonymous call. The voice was steady but laced with tremors of guilt. "I'm not sure why I'm doing this now," the woman said, "but I think someone should know. My brother, he was Coach McKinney. He's gone now, but he told me something before he died. Said he didn't mean to, but he lost control. That a student had threatened to speak up. He called it a mistake, said he just wanted to scare the boy, to keep him quiet. But something happened. He said, I tripped up and then it was too late. He never said the boy's name, but I remember he got so quiet after that year, always watching the door, always afraid someone would knock." Elena's hand clenched around the receiver. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked softly, but the woman was already crying. "I can't. Please don't find me. I just needed someone to know." Then she hung up. The trace led to a public phone booth in rural Connecticut. No security cameras, no prints, just a voice from the past cracking open the final door. But for Elena, it was the last confirmation she needed, not for a court, but for history. That same week, as part of ongoing campus renovations, the school's administration agreed to temporarily relocate a small memorial garden planted behind the library, a spot once overlooked, but recently transformed into a place of reflection for students. The flowers were simple, white daisies and bluebells, but the soil beneath had never been tested. Elena requested a full forensic sweep, and within days the ground was marked and excavated carefully by state forensic anthropologists. The discovery came on a Thursday morning when the team uncovered a compact burial site wrapped in a decaying plastic tarp. Inside they found skeletal remains, small, fragile, consistent with a child aged 11 to 12. Beside the bones were remnants of fabric consistent with school uniforms used at Pine Ridge in the 1970s, a single cracked shoe heel, and a rusted belt buckle. There were no ID tags, no note, no final message. But the dental records, preserved from the Mercier family archive, matched. The remains were those of Owen Mercier. The forensic report was clear and heartbreaking. Cause of death, undetermined, though evidence of trauma to the rib cage and upper spine suggested blunt force. Estimated time of death, within 72 hours of his disappearances. Manner of burial, unmarked, shallow, likely done at night and concealed before any initial police searches. It explained why cadaver dogs had found nothing, why no neighbors saw movement, because the body had never left the property. Ellen stood at the site hours after the forensic team had left, staring at the disturbed earth. A light breeze rustled through the library's windows behind her, and she could almost hear the faint echo of chalk against blackboard, of sneakers squeaking in the old gym, of a boy's laughter frozen forever in November 1974. She walked back into the building, down the same hallway that had once echoed with hurried footsteps and secrets. She entered the office where the journal page had been found, where a principal once promised to follow up. She looked out the window and saw the children of today running across the new playground, unaware of the soil's memory beneath them. The case file was finally marked as resolved. The official statement from Medford Police read, "The disappearance and death of Owen Mercier in 1974 is now confirmed to have involved staff misconduct and failure to act upon student reports. No living suspects remained." But Elena didn't care for official language. She met Genevieve Mercier's cousin, the last living relative, and handed her the report. The woman cried quietly and asked, "Do you think he was scared?" Elena paused, then answered, "Yes, but I think he hoped someone would find him. And in a way, someone finally did." A week later, the school held a private memorial. A new plaque was installed near the old garden, now renamed Owen's Corner. It read, "For the boy who never came home, your voice is no longer lost," and beneath it a quote from the note found in his locker. "He watches the cracks in the wall." The staff stood in silence. Students watched from windows. The past, finally, was no longer buried. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the mystery we uncover. I'm curious, what part of Owen's story shocked you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments below. Let's see how far this story has reached.